Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, September 14th, 2022. And unless you're new here, and if you are, welcome. I'm so grateful for you joining us for the first time today. Well, otherwise, if you're not, you've probably heard me reference the real American Revolution as being a revolution in thought. As John Adams put it years later, he said the revolution actually happened before the war commenced. I got to turn off my phone here. The revolution actually happened before the war commenced. It was a radical change in the views of the people, their political, their social, their economic viewpoints, their views on sovereignty and final authority of rather than being in the hands of a king or a queen, it was the people being in charge. All power came from the people. So on this episode, I'm going to go through what I see as four of the most essential principles of the revolution that need to be applied today in a modern revolution in thought if there's going to be any hope of stopping the largest government in history. But first of all, a quick hello and a huge thank you to everyone who's here with me today. I appreciate you, whether again it's your first time or you've been here for every episode since day one. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on these mainstream platforms, hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Richard Banks and Snowfish, Cheriton Farmer, Israel Poet Fisherman, Kirk Morrison, Liberty Revolutionary, Bud Sims and Clay Kent, Lisa, Natural Law in Iowa, Cece or Chechi, I'm not sure how you say it, in Alaska, Balu, Dave Simmons here in SoCal, Alan Hughes, Erwin Haverneck, Haji in Michigan, and everyone else. I know I missed a few people there, but just kind of scrolling through and allowing us another minute or so. There's Andrea Rodriguez as well. Thank you all for being here. I'll look back in the chat a little bit later in the episode or sometime in the next day or so. I get a lot of ideas, questions, comments. I know Happy Snowfish left a few of them there, but I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes, and sometimes I'm able to take those on. But anyways, I should also mention that if you want to follow along with the original source documents and find all the quotes that I'm going to be mentioning in this episode, you want to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. That's our show homepage. You find all the archives of the show, and I publish a blog post for each individual episode 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. You can find all the different platforms, and there's a section in there with all the reference links because I'm just scratching the surface. Anyways, 4 principles of the revolution that need to be adopted today. Without these, I don't think there's any chance of our generation starting the process of turning things around. And we should also know that this is not going to be easy. If you listen to my show on Monday, I pointed out some views from Jefferson and Paine and Samuel Adams and others to point out that there's just no silver bullet. It is going to take an endless list of efforts from the people. So the first principle that I want to go with is that the feds are never going to stop themselves. Government does not restrict its own power. And most people who are trying to get you to do something, there's a problem, Washington, D.C. is too big, they just want you to support some candidate or support some lawsuit or some single law. Everyone seems to be promoting a silver bullet that does not require exertion by the people. Just sit back and send some loot. Not that we would turn down any loot here because we need it to survive, but we need to combine some of these types of things with the more powerful stuff. But we got to start out with recognizing that government isn't going to stop itself. It doesn't matter how many times you vote the bums out, the new people end up just being bums, or if you rarely get one person, they're so overwhelmed and so outnumbered that the system doesn't let them, do anything positive. Here's James Lincoln in the first quote that I want to cite here today. In a speech in the South Carolina House in January of 1788, as they were ramping up to prep for the ratification debates, he first asked, "What is liberty?" And he answered it by saying, well, it's the power of governing yourselves. So you are free when you are in charge of yourselves. He's not necessarily an ANCAP, for those of you who might be wondering, but certainly recognizing that if you're going to have freedom, it does start out with self-government. And then he goes on, he says, let the people just once trust their liberties out of their own hands, and what will be the consequence? First, a haughty, imperious aristocracy, and ultimately a tyrannical monarchy. And although we may not have a hereditary monarchy, we have what people like Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Jefferson warned against, which is really an elective despotism. So you don't have liberty if you don't govern yourselves. You don't have liberty if you wait on government to do the right thing. And that's what Patrick Henry was getting at as well in the Virginia ratifying convention in the summer of 1788. He said, show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men without a consequent loss of liberty. And he said it absolutely, the dearest privilege was lost every single mad attempt. So as soon as you rely on government to limit itself in the hopes that government will do the right thing, maybe you get lucky once in a while, once every few decades, but the overarching storyline is growth of power, almost incessant. And that is a big reason why we live under the largest government in history today, because I think most people's strategy for generations has been going to the government to somehow get the government to limit the power of the government. And that is just dumb. Another one here from Governor Clinton in New York, the original one. History does not furnish a single instance of a government once established voluntarily yielding up its power. So it's not going to come easy. And the Anti-Federalists, I think, were much more aggressive in warning about this. The Federalists recognized that power would always expand and try to grow. But some of the debate was over, well, we are looking a little further down the line, I think. And I did an episode about this just a few weeks ago, August 26, 2022, Anti-Federalist warnings, government power is forever. And the warning there is even if you want something done, if you get the government to do it, it's never going to go away. That power will be there forever. There is no such thing as a temporary, even emergency power. And even if you don't think it's an emergency power and you think they should be able to do it, and you like the people who are exercising that power, eventually those people are going to be dead and other people are going to be in charge, and you probably don't like how they're going to use it. Eventually, all power in government will be in the hands of people who want to use it against you. So I will link to that episode in the show notes in case you haven't checked it out yet, although I think it's a pretty good one. And then here's Richard Henry Lee hammering this message home in a letter to Patrick Henry. It must never be forgotten that the liberties of the people are not so safe under the gracious manner of government as by the limitation of power. So you just don't rely on government to do the right thing. You've probably heard me talk about John Dickinson in his famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, which gave him the nickname Penman of the Revolution because they were so widely read, more so than anything up until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. But he asked, who are a free people? He said, no, it's not the people who just happen to be living under a government that's doing the right thing. And I'm paraphrasing. He was much better at this. And that's the same thing that Richard Henry Lee is saying here. Your liberties are not safe just because government is doing the right thing. You're only safe if government is so controlled and checked that as soon as it tries to get out of line, it gets pushed right back. And that's how Dickinson put it as well. And that brings me to principle number 2, parchment barriers. Constitutions don't enforce themselves. Words on paper don't enforce themselves. They never did, they were never expected to, and they never will. So people just want to say, we just got to waive the Constitution. Call your congressman and tell him what that Commerce Clause really means. We get that all the time, less than what we used to. But anytime we post something about the original legal meaning of some phrase in the document, we're either going to get people who say, send that to Washington, D.C., they need to learn this. Or we hear, well, see, it's a failure. It's an assumption that constitutions can enforce themselves, and they're inanimate objects, and they're rules, but it requires human action to enforce that. John Taylor of Caroline in 1814, in the publication, An Inquiry into the Principles and Policy of the Government of the United States of that year, he talked about this as well. He says, a government, good or bad, can easily take away that liberty by charters, which was created by charters. Before the idea of deriving liberty from charter or compact became fashionable, the evils produced by bad governments were temporary. The short version he followed with, maybe this started before that part of the quote. He said, the error of parchment liberty has made liberty the creature of parchment. It's as if you get your liberty and rights from a document, and then the people in power who are going to have the power to kind of interpret that document and use that document how they want to, well, they're always going to end up restricting it. It makes, once you look at your liberty as coming from words on paper, you're screwed. You have to look at it as inherent natural rights, natural rights through natural law by the nature of your birth. So as long as you rely on government to, again, determine its own limits, it's a very similar message to point number one. Those limits will certainly not exist. Even James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, talked about the document he was so influential in drafting and helping pass. He wrote in Federalist 48, he called it just a mere parchment barrier, recognizing, again, that words on paper don't defend themselves. You need something else. And he said a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hand. So if you just worry about getting the words on paper right. Now, Dickinson himself, who we could call the father of the Articles of Confederation, he did end up supporting ratification of the Constitution. He was recognizing a good constitution promotes but does not always produce a good administration. He also recognized that, of course, you want to have the limits on power to be very clearly spelled out. That makes it more difficult for them to go beyond the line. Thomas Jefferson, when he was reviewing an early draft of Benjamin Franklin's proposal for the Articles of Confederation, which was never considered, this was 1775, I believe, in his notes on it, he said he didn't want to see phrases like general welfare, because that's a phrase that could be used by people in power to expand it. It's an undefined term in many situations. Even if you can understand the original legal meaning of it, a lot of people don't, and then you run into problems. So if you rely on a government to do the right thing, once again, it will always expand that power. And if you rely on a constitution to enforce itself, well, that's just absolutely silly. Of course, you want the Constitution to be as good as possible, but it does take something else. Here's Governor Morris, who put it this way: considerate men are not the dupes of patriotic professions. Neither will they confide the defense of their liberty to paper bulwarks. Point number one was about the feds will never limit their own power. And I primarily focused on messages from Anti-Federalists. But people like Morris and Madison, well, they are certainly on the Federalist side, more of the big government side of the time. And I did an episode on this June of 2021. It's one of my favorites, actually. Blame the Constitution. Words on paper don't enforce themselves. I will link to that in the show notes so you can check that one out when you have a chance. And that brings me to number three. What does enforce the Constitution? Well, Dickinson told us. He said, well, it is ultimately up to the supreme sovereignty of the people. He said it is their duty to watch, their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the way he put it, or in the Roman phrase, that the Republic receive no damage. So it's up to the people to defend their own Constitution and their own liberty, and that means learning how to exercise their rights, whether the government wants them to or not. Here's from Algernon Sidney. And Thomas Jefferson, years later, I think it was like 1803 or so, he, in a letter, said that Sidney wrote the best elementary book on the principles of government which has ever been published in any language. Any language. He thought this was the best foundation for government. And here's one of the things that Sidney had to say: that which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed. And this was from the 17th century. It certainly influenced Jefferson and his thinking. You can see his thinking in his duty to resist, calling for nullification of any act outside the Constitution. So if it is not within the bounds of the Constitution, it's not law. It's not just. And if it's not law, it ought not to be obeyed. So that's a very important foundational principle. Patrick Henry in 1765 put together some resolutions against the Stamp Act, and he said that the people were not bound to yield obedience to any taxes that were not within the purview of the Parliament's power. So there's a line in the sand of what government is authorized to do, and when they go beyond it, you're not bound to yield obedience. Now, carried forward into the ratification debates and the principles of the Constitution, we see that same type of message. And I can get into a lot of detail on this, but I'm just scratching the surface. James Madison told us that individuals, cities, and states should utilize a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union to stop federal acts that are constitutional but bad policy, or unconstitutional. Refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. And even Alexander Hamilton. You don't hear me citing him too often. Let me see if I can find this quote in here. He was talking about the Supremacy Clause in Federalist 33, and he said this: "It will not follow from this doctrine that acts of the large society which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, will become the supreme law of the land." Short version, outside of the Hamiltonian text, is they're authorized to exercise powers as long as they're within the powers delegated in the Constitution. As soon as they go beyond that, it's not supreme. This is talking about the Supremacy Clause. Supremacy Clause is very, very limited. They're only supreme acts of the federal government when they're within the bounds of the Constitution. But here's the juicy part from Hamilton. He said, as soon as they go beyond this, they're not supreme law of the land. These instead will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. The people are not treating acts of usurpation as acts of usurpation. They're treating them many situations as a joyous event, and many other situations as a burden that you just have to deal with until you can find a government administration that is willing to say, oh, all that stuff that we've been doing, we don't need to do that anymore. Again, I mentioned Jefferson. Here he is in his draft for the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. He said, "Where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy." Not just a good idea, not something to try after you've tried everything else. It's the rightful remedy for all acts outside the Constitution. And here's the great Lysander Spooner from the 19th century. This is in his, this is one of my top publications, my favorites. Defense for Fugitive Slaves, along with Trial by Jury, is another really good one. But I will link to this in the show notes because you should read it. It's really awesome stuff. He said, the right of the people to resist usurpation on the part of the government is strictly a constitutional right. And the exercise of the right is neither rebellion against the Constitution nor revolution. It is a maintenance of the Constitution itself by keeping the government within the Constitution. I mean, think about it. If the government goes, as soon as the government takes a single step beyond the Constitution, if the people in huge numbers resist, refuse to comply, they will effectively nullify those acts, even if the government tries to persist. But compliance breeds what John Dickinson called the detestable precedent. It establishes a ground floor for them to do more and more and more. I covered Spooner and Dickinson, going all the way back to Dickinson, the founding generation, his strategy to stop usurpation in an episode last fall in September of 21. I will link to that in the show notes. It's Spooner's strategy to stop usurpation, how to deal with acts of the government when the government doesn't follow the rules, which is, well, constantly. And that brings me to number 4. The states don't actually have to help the feds violate your rights. Just because the feds pass something, the states are not required to do anything. And while it's ultimately up to the people to defend their own constitution and their own liberty, it is less difficult. It is very difficult in every situation, but it is less difficult if the states don't act like mere corporations of the empire. If the states stop acting like the enforcement arm, it is much more difficult for the feds to enforce their garbage. We can think about the ATF, just a quick side note. They've got about 5,500 employees for the entire country and can close around 10,000 cases per year with help of the states in almost every situation. Now, if the people refuse to comply in the millions, and the states on top of it, like in Missouri in the Second Amendment Preservation Act, which was passed into law just recently, then it becomes even more difficult for that unconstitutional federal agency to enforce its unconstitutional acts. So the states don't have to help. We know that Patrick Henry said that the people were not bound to yield obedience to the Stamp Act. John Dickinson later that year specifically said that you have to refuse to participate. There was resistance by local sheriffs calling on localities to stop participating. For example, in Frederick County, Maryland, and I've got a link to a short blog post that Mike Meharry did on this, that I think is really interesting and I haven't really covered very much, but you should read about this. But here's the short version. On November 23rd, 1765, the Frederick County Court in Maryland issued a formal, unanimous ruling that the Stamp Act was to be ignored, effectively nullifying it in practice in the county. Mike says the decision to carry on official business as usual without the required stamp paper effectively nullified the Stamp Act in Frederick County. So anybody who went to the local court and there was a problem, oh, well, they're not using the stamp paper. The court said, well, no one needs to abide by this. So then the local officials stopped participating, and that renders it null and void in practice. The law remained on the books, Mike says, but it wasn't observed, nor was it ever enforced in the county. And that's something that needs to happen more and more and more today. We also, of course, had the Suffolk Resolves from Dr. Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, and others, primarily Warren, that specifically called on people to ignore the government courts, to use free market arbitration. This is in 1774, urged the sheriffs to stop enforcing the coercive acts. And then if we jump forward to ratification debates during the time of the Constitution, here again, Alexander Hamilton, he understood this process, even though he was complaining about it. He wasn't being one of the good guys here. He just recognized that if the states weren't going to help, if the feds required the states to help and the states said, well, then the thing's dead in the water. And here's how he put it, Federalist number 16. If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or act evasively, and the measure is defeated. And that's what we have today. Most federal programs require a partnership between the feds and the states, whether it's local emergency management, healthcare programs, Environmental Protection Agency regulations, Commerce Clause regulations, the war on drugs, the war on your natural right to self-defense, whatever it may be. You may find one or two federal agents involved in a prosecution, but generally it's local law enforcement doing most of the work. And James Madison, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, in Federalist 46, said that states and individuals should use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And surprisingly, I'm never a fan of the Supreme Court, but when they get something right, they get something right. And for over a century, even the Supreme Court has agreed. They've been on board with this, where the states don't have to participate in the enforcement of any federal act or regulatory program. It's called the anti-commandeering doctrine. I want you guys to understand this, because when you talk to state or local legislators and you say, hey, we want to stop enforcement of federal gun control here, we want our local officials to stop participating in that, most of them are pretty dumb. Unfortunately, we're all victims. We had to go through a government-run or government-approved school system, so it takes a lot of work on the side, on our own, a lot of personal motivation to learn how things are supposed to be rather than just how the government tells us they're supposed to be. And so when you tell a local, government official, whatever we want to call these people, I don't want to say things too bad, because sometimes a few of them will listen to the show, and those are at least willing to learn, so I appreciate those of you who do that. Anyway, so you tell them this, and they're like, what? We can't do that. It's a federal law. It's supreme law of the land. But even if it was a constitutional federal act, the states still don't have to participate. And the Supreme Court has held this view over and over and over, all the way back to some dicta back in 1842 in the case of Prigg versus Pennsylvania, where Joseph Story suggested, even this whole Fugitive Slave Act thing, well, this is a federal law, but the states, they don't have to participate in helping enforce this. And the most recent case was in 2018, but I covered all of that in an episode, Anti-Commandeering, the legal basis for refusing to cooperate. And there are a lot of ways that states could do this. I did mention the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act. I'll get to that again in a moment. But first of all, they can legalize what the federal government prohibits, make legal. Say, even if the federal government says you can't do blank, well, on the state level, we're going to say you can. And we've seen 37 states do this on a plant. And the more that they do this, the more that the federal prohibition on that plant, this natural occurring plant, is falling apart at the seams. It's only a matter of time before that's done. And then, of course, ban participation in federal enforcement. The great example of that is in Missouri. I know there's a lot of people from Missouri out in the live chat. I appreciate you guys. You're really kicking some butt. The Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act bans state and local law enforcement agencies from participating in any purely federal gun control scheme, none of which should exist. It's severing relationships between local law enforcement and even, I think, Highway Patrol or whatever they call it there in Missouri. It's not CHP, obviously, and the ATF. So that's very positive. You can just opt out of federal programs like grants to militarize local police or controlling local emergency management or whatever they're doing, throwing out funds, education funding. They can turn down this stuff. It's not easy, but it does happen. They can also opt out of things like the federal equitable sharing asset forfeiture program. So legalize what the feds prohibit, ban enforcement of federal programs, opt out of federal programs that don't require your enforcement, and then also you can prohibit what the feds claim is legal. Now, in a lot of cases, that gets you into a sticky situation. I'm not talking about restricting liberty. I'm talking about banning government from doing things that the central government says is okay, like warrantless mass surveillance, whether it be through cell site simulators or automated license plate readers, or things like parallel construction where local law enforcement gets warrantless surveillance information from the FBI or NSA and pretends that it wasn't gained without a warrant and just lies about it. So they can stop doing that stuff. They can stop doing no-knock warrants and all kinds of other stuff. And so those are four main things that we need for a revolution in thought to take on the largest government in world history. If you did not hear last Friday's episode yet, Blueprint for Liberty, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774, you can get some follow-up steps pushing for sheriffs, ignoring courts, some tax resistance, things like that, that came along after there were a lot of people on board with the message for liberty. And then Mercy Otis Warren, I think, sums it up best. She said, "The origin of all power is in the people, and they have an incontestable right to check the creatures of their own creation." And I think that sums up all four of these principles best. It comes from the people, and the people have to act like they are in charge instead of a population on its knees begging for permission. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back. How do we resist unconstitutional federal fiat reserve money? Is Happy Snowfish? That could be an entire episode, but certainly the less that you use the fiat system, the better. There are alternatives to it. Look up goldbacks. That's goldback.com, I believe, or goldback.org. Just do a web search for goldback. That's an option. And the more that we encourage this type of thing, the more that we do that. It's not easy, but that's a big part of it. Mark Jackson says, "You're amazing. Love listening to you speak on history." Thank you so much. You're amazing for being here. And I am really just lucky. I certainly don't have a degree. I'm no lawyer. I have not been, I was abused enough by the government school system as I was growing up, but I didn't go all the way through with it. And I think that's where I was most lucky. Something was just wrong, and I started doing the education on the side. So I'm just lucky and honored to have a chance to share what I've learned with you and what I continue to learn. If you look back at my episodes of the last 4 years, sometimes I'm scared to look at some of the old ones. They probably suck. Haji 1954 says, "Anti-commandeering doctrine for the win." Absolutely. If the people refuse to participate and states and localities stop doing the enforcement, the federal enforcement falls apart at its seams most of the time. Here's the dirty little secret they don't want you to know. Partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. Kirk Morrison says, "Our government has usurped almost all our natural rights." And I would actually, this is just a gut response. I think in many situations it's probably all of them. And even though people say, "Oh, well, you're doing free speech here." Well, it's only as long as they let me. That isn't really freedom. If we're going back to who is a free people, what makes for freedom, that isn't freedom. That's just luck. And so far, living under the largest government in history, if we still exercise some of our rights, that, of course, is a positive. It just means that they don't have the cojones to push it further yet. But the more that people comply with stuff, the worse and worse and worse it's going to get. Fuzzy Fork is talking about 281 years. It was established that no one in government could infringe on firearm rights. Well, there certainly was some restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms early on. Not a lot of detail on that, but if we look at 1934, a lot of people will say they just don't want new federal restrictions, and they ignore everything that happened from 1934 through 2018 and beyond, as if there has been no federal gun control. That's my expertise. I don't really know as much about what's going on in the states, but states are very tyrannical as well. I generally make the case that most of what the states do is funded by the feds. So if you really want to look at the root cause of the problem, it's the federal government pushing their programs, pushing their militarization programs, sending money to law enforcement and enforcing them, or encouraging them to focus on federal enforcement priorities. I'm not sure about the math, but Fusty Fork, it's very important to understand that the founding generation, whether the number is right or whenever we started seeing some gun control, what's most important is that the founding generation looked at the right of self-defense as either the or a primary law of nature. Without it, you can't defend the rest. It's so essential. Some people talked about it as being, without the right to self-defense, words on paper are just absolutely worthless. Anyways, here's Tom Casey. What do you say to people who say, if you don't like the USA, go try Mexico, see how you like it? Oh, I don't grade on a curve. So I support liberty and I want the Constitution enforced. And that doesn't mean that, oh, just because someone else is worse, everything is awesome. I figure you probably are, you're probably on board with that too. And I'm sure you hear that. You put a laughing emoji with that as well. But that's what people say. If you don't like it here, move to Cuba, move to France, move to Mexico. But then again, I've been to Mexico a bunch. Baja California is one of my favorite places on earth. It is so incredibly safe. It has not been destroyed. I feel safer when I go down south of Rosarito, Porto Nuevo is an amazing, beautiful, comfortable place. Not a heavy tourist spot either, like Rosarito. So, if I could afford it, maybe I would go live in Mexico. I don't know, but I appreciate that comment, Tom. That's a really good one to talk about because so many people will say that. Oh, okay, you're just complaining. But no, we have to talk about the way things are supposed to be. Thomas Jefferson, once the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 passed, and he sent a letter about it to James Madison, he recognized and he told Madison, hey, we should really affirm all the principles here. But strategically on the ground, we should push as far as events will render prudent. So we always have to talk about our ultimate principles, even if we can't get there in one fell swoop, one step. We have to recognize, as Jefferson told us, that the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. But if we're only lowering our standards to the final goal as being halfway there, how are we ever going to get all the way where we're supposed to be? Hopefully that helps out. Anyways, I really appreciate you guys being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. If you want to help us get this kind of message out to more people, please do consider our membership program. It starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.